I, Anna, took care of my husband and in-laws for 10 years. Still they were plotting to throw me out after everything. I have had enough now. I, Anna Stewart, 34F, stared out the kitchen window of my home, watching the autumn leaves drift lazily from the maple trees. I absently wiped her hands on a dish rag, my mind miles away. The kitchen, sparkling clean and filled with the aroma of freshly baked apple pie, was my sanctuary. But it wasn't enough to soothe my frayed nerves. My heart was heavy with pain, yet I continued with her chores, just as I always did, and the thoughts of my childhood came flooding back. I stood at the edge of the small backyard, my fingers gripping the rough bark of the old oak tree. I was 7 years old, but my eyes were already too wise for my age. I stared at the sky, blinking rapidly to hold back my tears. I had learned early on that crying in my house only made things worse. Inside, I could hear her parents shouting. Again. My father's voice was sharp, cruel. My mother's was quieter but filled with bitterness, like a blade cutting through silk. You're useless, Laura. You can't even keep the house in order. My father roared. My mother's voice came through, broken and weary. I'm doing my best. But you, the slap came before my mother could finish. I flinched, even from outside. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my forehead against the tree trunk. Wishing I could disappear, no one spoke to me. No one asked how my day was. No one tucked me in that night, they never did. By the time I was 24, I was desperate for love. Any love. I had never known what it felt like to be adored, to be cherished. I dreamed of someone seeing me, truly seeing me, and wanting me, and then I met Greg. He wasn't perfect, but he was charming. He was funny and confident, and when he looked at me, I felt something I had never felt before, wanted. On our first date, he brought flowers. I blushed when he brushed my hair behind my ear. And when he kissed me, I felt as though the universe had finally given me a taste of what I had longed for my entire life. Greg said all the right things. He told me I was beautiful. He called me special. He made me feel as though I belonged to someone. Finally, I didn't notice the subtle red flags. How he always talked about his needs, never mine. How he rarely asked about my day. How he quickly grew irritable when things didn't go his way. I ignored them all. I was too hungry for love to notice the emptiness beneath his words, so, when Greg asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation. I was certain I had found home in him. For the past 10 years, I had been the backbone of the Stewart household. I worked tirelessly, both inside and outside the home. My salary from my job as an office manager covered the mortgage, utility bills, and all major expenses. I cooked, cleaned, and cared for my in-laws, Martha and Charles, with a devotion that would put most daughters-in-law to shame. My husband, Greg, was rarely around, emotionally and physically. When he was home, he barely acknowledged my presence. I had married Greg when I was just 24. Back then, I was filled with hope and adoration for the man who had swept me off my feet with promises of a beautiful future. However, over the years, Greg changed. He became distant, cold, and disinterested. I blamed myself at first, convincing herself that if I worked harder or loved more fiercely, Greg would return to me. But he never did. Instead, he became crueler in his indifference. The worst part wasn't Greg's emotional neglect, it was his family's exploitation. My in-laws treated me like a servant, despite me being the one providing for them. They demanded fresh meals, clean laundry, and constant attention. I complied without complaint, driven by my love for Greg and the misguided hope that if I cared for his family, he might love me again. One evening, as I returned home from work, I overheard a conversation that shattered my illusion of love. Standing in the hallway, I listened to the hushed voices of Greg, Martha, and Charles. She'll never see it coming, Greg chuckled. Once we push her out, I'll marry Lisa. She's everything Anna isn't. And the best part? Anna already paid for most of the house. We'll have it all without her. My breath caught in my throat. I clutched the wall for support, fingers trembling. My heart, the same heart that had once loved Greg so blindly, felt as though it had been ripped from my chest, but in that moment of devastation, something else bloomed, a cold, calculating resolve. I wouldn't be their victim. Not anymore. My mind worked fast. For the next few days, I kept up the facade. I cooked, she cleaned, and paid the bills. I smiled at Greg's mother when she made snide remarks. I even laughed at her rude jokes. I was docile. Submissive. Or so they thought. As the primary earner, my name was on the mortgage, the bank accounts, and every utility bill. The house belonged to me, not them. Greg and his family had only assumed I was too naive to ever take control. The following week, I took the first step in my plan. I waited until Greg left for work, and in-laws went to visit a family friend. I had called in sick at her office, but instead of resting, I made a few calls. By noon, 2 moving trucks were parked outside the house. I supervised the workers as they carried out every single item that belonged to MW, the expensive furniture I had bought, the electronics I had paid for, the appliances, the rugs, and even the dishes. I made sure to pack up everything that wasn't bolted to the floor. My personal belongings, of course, were handled with care. But when it came to the family's things, the gaudy heirlooms and the old, decrepit furniture they had guilt her into keeping, I left them behind. Useless relics of a family I no longer considered my own. I walked through the house once more, ensuring I hadn't left anything of value. The place looked barren, lifeless. The walls were stripped of decor. The once cozy living room was just an empty shell. I smiled. I wasn't going to leave without securing the ultimate blow. I sat down in the now empty living room and pulled out a folder of documents. I had spent the last few days visiting a lawyer. What Greg and his family didn't know was that I had proof, bank statements, payment records, and detailed financial documents that showed my hard-earned money had kept the roof over their heads. My lawyer had already filed a claim on the property. I had the right to demand the sale of the house to cover my financial contribution. I left the legal notice on the kitchen counter, with a note in my elegant handwriting: "You have 1 week to vacate the premises." "Anna, what the hell is this?" Greg roared, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You have 1 week to vacate the premises," I said calmly, holding out a legal eviction notice. "Since I'm the one who paid for this house, I'm reclaiming it. You'll need to find somewhere else to live." Martha's face turned pale. Charles's hands shook. Greg's face twisted with rage. "You can't do this." He spat. "You can't just throw us out." "I can," I said, my voice steady. "And I am." Over the next few days, Greg and his family tried everything. They called me repeatedly. I ignored them. They showed up at my office, but the receptionist informed them that I was out on leave. His mother even came to my apartment one night, begging, sobbing on the doorstep, but I refused to answer. I stood behind the door, listening to the woman who once ridiculed her now whimper like a child. "You ungrateful bitch." My mother-in-law eventually spat, slamming her fists against the door. "You'll regret this. You'll pay." I didn't even flinch. Greg's sister tried to reach me through mutual friends, sending messages about how family should stick together. I laughed bitterly at the irony. And Greg? He finally came face to face with me after 3 days. He showed up at my office, disheveled and desperate. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. "Anna, please," he whispered, grabbing my wrist in the parking lot. "We can fix this." I made a mistake. I pulled her hand back as though his touch repulsed me. "A mistake?" I asked coolly. My eyes narrowed. "You conspired with your family to destroy me. You planned to throw me out like garbage and marry someone else." His voice cracked. "It wasn't like that. I was just confused." I smiled faintly, but it didn't reach my eyes. "No, Greg," I said softly. "You were very clear. You didn't want me. Now, you don't have me." I turned and walked away without another word. My heart was closed. As the week came to an end, Greg and his family were forced to leave. With nowhere to go, they scrambled to find a place to stay. Greg's mistress, Lisa, who had once been so eager to take my place, quickly lost interest when she realized Greg no longer had a home or money. The house was put on the market, and the proceeds went straight to me, every last cent. Martha and Charles, now homeless and penniless, were reduced to seeking help from distant relatives who barely tolerated them. Greg's life fell apart. His employer terminated him due to his erratic behavior and lack of professionalism. His relationship with Lisa crumbled, and his parents turned on him, blaming him for their downfall. Me, on the other hand, thrived. With her burden lifted, I invested in myself. I traveled, took up painting, a hobby I had abandoned during my marriage, and began volunteering at a local shelter. Slowly, I rediscovered herself, free from the chains of betrayal and heartbreak. I moved into a beautiful apartment overlooking the river. I redecorated the space with the expensive furniture I had taken from the house. I wasn't bitter. I was free. The revenge was complete. Greg and his family had destroyed themselves, just as they had tried to destroy me. I, at last, was free.